I think we're live, so I shall welcome everybody again. Welcome out there, everybody. I'm Victoria Prever, I'm the food editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Welcome to our second event in our series of celebrations of Israel's 73rd birthday that we, the JC, are running in conjunction with the Israeli Government Tourist Office, IGTO. We celebrated food last week with a really interesting panel about everything Israel has to offer. And as many of us know, the wines are also fantastic. We've got a fantastic panel tonight, but I'm going to introduce you to your host, our host for the evening, and he will then introduce the panel. Avachai Sabari. I'm going to read a little so I don't miss anything out. He's the founder and owner of tour company Via Sabra, which was founded by him in 2012. Avachai's worked in the hospitality industry in his early career, and he combined that with his passion for Israel to establish Via Sabra, which runs some really interesting and different tours, not get on and off a bus type tour. Before establishing Via Sabra, he was a restaurateur and a sommelier at leading Israeli restaurants, so he also knows a bit about his wine and loves wine. So I'm going to hand over to Avachai, who's then going to take it away for the evening. Oh, and I must just say before I hand over that we will have 15 minutes at the end for Q&As. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the question box. I'll keep an eye on it, and we'll feed those in from about 15 minutes before the end. So feel free to ask questions. Thank you. Thanks, Avachai.
So Victoria, thank you very, very much for having us over. I am beyond excited to be here and host this together with you. I think before anything, I wish we could, I feel kind of friends with everyone on our panel, and I wish we could just sit together and have a glass of wine together and not look at screens and cameras, but maybe the next time we'll do this face to face. So I'm excited to join you tonight, and I would like to invite our four wonderful panelists. I'll start with winemaker Jeff Morgan. Jeff is the owner of Covenant Winery, which I assume most of you know, in California. Regarded as arguably the finest kosher wine in the world, he decided to invest in Israel with Covenant Israel, a very well-known winery here as well. Sommelier Maura Bernstein. Maura is one of Israel's most famous sommeliers. She was winner of the Yarden Award, probably the most important wine award here in Israel, Sommelier Wine Award here in Israel. And she was chosen the best sommelier here in Israel. This was 2018, if I remember correctly. Wine tourism specialist Guy Haran. Guy is owner of Vinspiration, a wine tourism company, and the author of the newly published extremely important book, Wine Journey in Israeli Adventure. And then last but not least, Adam Montefiore, which most of us, I'm sure, know, a wine trade veteran and wine writer. Adam is a wine industry insider turned wine writer who has advanced Israeli wines for 35 years. Now he is the wine writer for the Jerusalem Post. So thank you again for joining us. And we're going to cover a few topics today. We're going to try to talk about regionality. We'll talk about wine tourism, and we're going to talk about trends a little bit. And instead of ending with trends, I actually want to start with it. And I want to bring the question to the four of you and ask you, what do you think, especially post-COVID-19, if I can say post-COVID-19, what do you think are the trends? What's about to happen? Where's the industry, consumption, and production going in 2021? Maura, I'm happy to start with you.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. Good evening. Very, very happy to be here. So for trends, I think I would maybe divide it in two. So I would say that industry trends are going in the direction of wines that are thinner, are lower in alcohol, are more elegant, or more nuanced, and not necessarily like the big, powerful, hot climate kind of wines. And for the consumer side, and that we can relate, I think, to the COVID situation that happened in the last year, that consumers are more willing to experiment. And we've seen it a lot going on in wine orders, wine deliveries at home. I mean, restaurants obviously were closed, so it wasn't necessarily in the hospitality area, but I think it's a trend that's going on for a few years, that people are more willing to experiment and are more interested of what they're drinking. And it's not just give me a red wine or a white wine. I want to know where the wine is coming from. I want to know who made it, how they made it, what are the grapes, and the whole story about the wine. And for another trend, I would say, if we do go to hospitality and we go back 9-10 years, most of the people were drinking reds, even on this, hot summer, humid evenings in Israel. And now if you walk into a restaurant, you see ice buckets all over the tables. People are drinking whites, people are drinking rosés. There's an enormous rosé boom in Israel. And so I would say really positive trends. I don't think that in consumption it's really kind of developing forward, but probably Adam would know more statistics, but very, very positive trends, and interesting to see where it will go.
Great, thank you. So transitioning to Adam. Adam, what do you think are the trends? Where is the wine industry going in 2021 and onward?
Well, firstly, I want to thank Victoria and the Jewish Chronicle and the Israel Government Tourist Office. It's a fantastic program of events you've got. It's a great honor to be invited. And the more the JC concentrates on food and wine, I'm for it. So thank you very much. A great initiative.
Pleasure.
Israel is undergoing enormous trends. I mean, when you think what changes there have been in the last 30 years in Israel, the developments have been far quicker than they've been in most other important wine producing countries. And it's not to say we're already France or it's Italy and we're better than Spain. We're still little Israel, pretty small and insignificant in the world of wine, but the actual changes have been enormous. And in the last 10 years, we've been a move to white wines. We've started making really good white wines, which we didn't before. There's a move to elegance, less in the mass market, more in the quality wines. There's a move to more elegance. There's a move to blends instead of varietals. There's a move to Mediterranean varietals, even if they're blended with Bordeaux varietals. And there's a big trend to people are starting to drink wine at home. This is something that's happened with COVID. I thought that people would drink less wine during COVID because wine would be a luxury that you could do without. But instead, we've learned that people who used to only drink out at restaurants have learned to buy a bottle of wine and drink it maybe over a couple of nights at home. So that is an enormous trend that's happening in consumer-wise. And the big thing we're all talking about for the first time in Israel is regions, vineyards, even plots within a vineyard. So Israel is galloping ahead, and we're now trying to find an identity for Israeli wines. And who knows where we'll be in 30 years' time.
Thank you.
That's
and sorry, Adam, go ahead.
No, I finished. That was it. Yeah.
Jeff, as the winemaker, as a producer, I want to move over to you and ask you, what do you feel? Where is the industry walking in 2021?
Well, hi everybody. It's hard to add a whole lot to what Mor and Adam said. They both very eloquently, I think, touched on the major themes of what we're experiencing now in the wine industry, both in Israel and internationally. I can say that 10 years ago, when I first came to Israel, just as a tourist looking around, and I tasted some really great wines, which is what inspired me to want to make wine here and be a part of what I think is perhaps the most exciting new wine region on planet Earth. I noticed that there were not very many white wines. There was almost no rosé. And I for the first couple of years here, I only made red wine. And then I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm going to make, some rosé and I'm going to make some Viognier. And people said, you're crazy. Nobody will buy that. And they were wrong. In fact, my best-selling wines in Israel in restaurants are my white wines and my rosés. So these are wines that are, I think the public has realized are the most versatile food pairing wines. You can enjoy a rosé, of course, with anything you order on the menu, whatever it is, from your steak to your fish to your salad, it doesn't matter. And today I was in a restaurant in Tel Aviv where I was drinking a white wine, and everybody was ordering fish, but I felt like there was this really great kebab that I wanted, and I just said, fine, I'll drink the kebab with the white wine. It was hot outside. We were all sitting outside, and that was fantastic. So really, yes, I think it was Mor who first touched on this. White wines, rosés are skyrocketing. I did notice that with COVID, I was concerned about anybody buying anything. It was pretty scary about a year ago in California. And in Israel, it was super scary for me because most of our business in Israel is restaurant-based. And I can tell you one trend that I've seen in the last week since everybody stopped wearing masks here in Israel is, and I believe we're 85% vaccinated in Israel. The restaurants are coming on strong, and sales, I don't know, all of a sudden we're selling wine again and it's the new trend is eating out. And it may be an old trend, but it's a new trend again. And I expect to be eating in many, many restaurants as we move forward over the next month or two and years.
Can I ask, are you seeing an uplift in sales then, Jeff, as the wine seller of the group? Are you seeing an uplift in sales already? Or
well, in Israel, it was pretty easy to have an uplift since 80% of our sales were restaurant based. And so we were 80% down this year. Huge uplift. I mean, in a couple of weeks, I mean, as the restaurants are opening, really it's starting to look like, you know, the before time, we call it. I think that online sales in Israel, which were almost non-existent a year ago, have definitely picked up quite a bit. Israelis were more reticent to buy online before COVID than, say, our American customers in California. And we've seen a real change in the buying patterns, which I don't think will affect retailers, because people still love to go into a retail shop and look at the bottles. But if they're not close to a retailer, they can easily order wine online and have it delivered. And that's definitely a trend that's not going away. Online buying is definitely here to stay.
Yeah. Can I ask you, as long as you brought it up, can I ask you a little bit about what do you see the differences between what's happening in California or in the States right now versus what's happening in Israel in the past few weeks, months?
Well, I just got back to Israel like 2 weeks ago, so I can't talk very much about, you know, what was happening before, although I have a lot of family and friends and colleagues here, and it was pretty quiet in Israel. Much of the time there were a couple of openings that then closed again, and that was very similar to California. We were pretty closed down. We could only work in our wineries and then go home and then go back to the winery and back home. It was somewhat confining, to say the least. I think there's a huge difference right now in Israel compared to California. I mean, California is starting to open, but Israel, at least here in Tel Aviv, and I was up in the Galilee yesterday, it's open. It's open for business, and it's a big party, and I'm really having a great time at this party.
That's great. So Guy, moving over to you, and I mean, we kind of introduced you as a wine tourism specialist, which you definitely are, but you have a much wider perspective, and you've been around for a pretty long time. Can you tell us specifically from the wine tourism perspective, can you tell us what you think the trends will be? Where is that going in 2021?
Okay, I like this question. Actually, and thanks for having me here, and it's a great pleasure being here, so thank you. I think we saw it this last year in Israel, and this is something that's happening all around the world, but we really saw it in Israel, because up until 5 years ago, wine tourism wasn't really a thing in Israel. I mean, if you're a wine geek, you might go to visit a winery, or maybe if someone made you go there. But in the last year or so, we saw hundreds of thousands of Israelis just going to wineries, young people going to spend their time there, sit on a balcony, drink some wine, be with friends, eat something, take some pictures for Instagram, just enjoy the nature, which is safer. I mean, in terms of COVID, but it's nicer, it's more interesting than just going to a coffee shop. And I think the result of that is the direct connection we have now between the producers and the customers, the clients. People now know the winemakers, know where the wine comes from. Not only wine, by the way, also cheese and beer and even fruits and vegetables. You want to know where you're buying it. And I think this trend just starting now, and it will become much stronger in the next years. And we can see it not only in Israel, but all around the world, where people are trying to understand where their food is coming from, and to be in direct connection with the producer. So that will be, I think, the main thing in the next few years. And I also want to go along with Adam and what he said. He talked about the wine revolution that we are experiencing now in Israel. We see the search for identity in Israel. We're trying to find the Israeli identity, the wine of Israel. I mean, I think we already know that we have high quality wine, but what is an Israeli wine? And this is something that we're trying to figure out. Many people are trying to work with indigenous grape varieties. We see in Israel that almost 20 different wineries have started already working with indigenous grape varieties such as Dabuki, Marawi, Jandali, Hamdani, Zeni, other grape varieties you'll find only here in Israel. And we're not talking only about the small boutique wineries, but you'll find it also in Barkan and Tepperberg and Jezreel winery and many other wineries. And some of the most succeeding wineries around the world, I mean, even in London, if you go to Ottolenghi restaurants, you'll find probably Kremizan wine with Jandali and other local grape varieties. So I think this is also something that's coming up. And eventually, I think that when someone looks at Israel, I'm also working with some importers around the world trying to look for wines in Israel. What's interesting for them is the Israeli identity. So it might be, for example, the indigenous grape varieties, and they're also looking for something that's very Israeli. I think another, maybe that will be the last trend that I hope to see coming up, are wines with Israeli identity and regional identity, and specifically wines coming from the desert of Israel, which has their own style, their own terroir, which is something you can't really find anywhere else in the world.
And do you think we will live to see a formal government supported wine route in Israel? South, north?
Yes, we are working on that right now, yes.
Okay.
I'm working with the Ministry of Tourism and with some NGOs in the desert of Israel, and yes, it will be a thing, and hopefully soon.
So we're going to come back to that in a minute, but Adam, I want to come to you just for a second. Guy mentioned a few indigenous varieties before, and for the people listening to us out there who haven't heard these names before, they all sound a little bit Arabic. Can you explain to us why that is? Can you give us the background? Can you maybe say a few words about how they were found? Why do they have these this Arabic sound?
Well, 170 years ago, when these first wineries were founded in the old city of Jerusalem, there were no Jewish-owned vineyards at all in Israel. Jews didn't farm. It was something that Jews didn't do. In fact, the first Jewish person that suggested that Jews should be farmers was Sir Moses Montefiore from my family, who recommended Jews should return to agriculture and plant vines. But no one planted vines until really Baron Edmund de Rothschild came in the 1880s and started planting vineyards everywhere. So previous to that, the vineyards were owned by Arabs, mainly in the Hebron area. I mean, if you go to Hebron today, it's like Spain. You look left and right, there's vineyards everywhere, but they're all table grapes. And the main grapes were Arabic grapes. They have Arabic names. So the Hamdani, Jandali, Dabuki, Bituni, Zaini, they were all there. The only variety that really was in Israel, which I remember in Israel as long as I've been in Israel, was Dabuki. And there's still some old 40-year-old vineyards of Dabuki in Israel. But this was a grape that was used secretly to blend into cheap white blends to pad them out, and also used for distillation. It was used, 30, 40 years ago. Israel sold millions of bottles of brandy, and that market has just gone to nothing because Israel have become feinschmeckers and only drink whiskey these days. So Dabuki you do find in Israel proper, let's put it that way. The Hamdani, Jandali, Zaini, Dabuki, Bituni, these are names that come up from 150 years ago, 170 years ago. And the people who are researching say it's a lot longer than that, even though I'm a bit cynical about that. I'm not sure it's correct, but I always say you shouldn't spoil a good story by the truth. And so it's a good story. The Marawi was the name the Arabs gave to Hamdani that was west of Jerusalem. So the Hamdani, it's known as Hamdani in the Hebron area. In the sort of mountains west of Jerusalem, it was known as Marawi. And so that was quite a clever choice by Recanati for launching their wine. So they have Arabic names. And of course, we have the Argamen, which is an Israeli creation. It was created by Professor Spiegel in the 70s. And it was made to replace Carignan. The main attributes to Argamen were color, and color, to provide a blending grape with good color. Avi Feldstein was the pioneer in the 2000s that started making a quality Argamen. And today, Jezreel Valley, 1848 Winery, are some of the wineries making good Argamens, and Barkan. And I know how popular these are becoming. In England and America, people are becoming fixated. It's become a fetish on indigenous varieties. And every country is researching indigenous varieties. It's going on in Cyprus, where they've got a lot already, but they're researching more. Yep. It's happening in Lebanon, where they thought they had 2, and now they found they've got a lot more. And it's even happening in Syria, where there's been a lot of research on indigenous varieties. So what's happening in Israel is happening all over the world. People are tired of Cabernet and Chardonnay and Merlot everywhere. People are looking for authenticity. But I would just like to paraphrase Jancis Robinson, who said, you shouldn't confuse interest with quality. These wines are produced in minuscule amounts. There might be quite a few wineries experimenting with them or starting to make these wines, but they're in tiny amounts and not many are available for export yet. And so it's a process that's going to take a long time. And a lot of them, I recently did a tasting with my family of all the indigenous varieties in Israel, all the Argamens, all the Hamdani, Jandali, from all the wineries. No one could say the tasting wasn't interesting, but if I could stand up and say these are the new best wines of Israel, no, it's a long way from that. But it's a process of selection and experimentation, and it will take generations. But it doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And the example I give is the Malagousia in Greece, which was found about 30, 40 years ago. And is now part of the standard offering of all Greek wines. And if they can do it, revive an ancient variety, we can do it too. So we'll always have this dichotomy of the blend between Palestinian varieties, Israeli varieties. And that's why we very cleverly call the region where these grapes come from the Central Mountains. Because if you say West Bank, you're accused of being a leftist. If you say Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, you're accused of being a rightist. And if it disregards the Palestinian regions, and there's some very good, promising Palestinian wineries. If you say Central Mountains, no one's going to shoot me. So we call it the Central Mountains, and everyone's happy. So it's very fascinating what's going on. And what is happening in every country in the Eastern Mediterranean is also happening in Israel, I'm glad to say. And, you know, they're always the first wines. The winos like us want to taste because of the curiosity. Yeah. But there's a long way from saying these are the great wines of Israel.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered the question, but I spoke for a long time.
It's great. I can listen to you all day, you know that. So Mor, I actually want to ask you, I'm pretty sure that from all our panelists, you're the one who's closest to the restaurant and the hospitality industry, and you're a wine consultant to quite a few restaurants. From the street, from the regular consumer, from the people that sit down in restaurants, do you feel there's a request? People are coming and asking? You have people sitting down in a restaurant. Are your sommeliers that you train, do they come back to you and say, you know, more and more people are asking for the Marawi by this and this winery?
I would say that from waiters or waitress staff that I train, then we always get into the conversation. Well, you have the old world, you have the new world, there's indigenous varieties each country. And always there's one who says, does Israel have indigenous varieties? And we get into to that conversation. Tourists definitely ask that question. It's not necessarily, well, I want that Marawi from the 2018 vintage. I had it last year, it was amazing. I think it's really, it's very much intriguing, and I'm very much in agreement with what Adam said about, I mean, these are not necessarily at the moment the most complex, very, very interesting wines, but I think if there would be a push towards very, very, very good viticulture and winemaking with these varieties, then we can see something interesting going on with them. As Adam said, it's a process. And it's like, for instance, I don't know, hybrids in the US. I mean, nobody really are interested in hybrids in the US, but some wineries are doing interesting things with them. So they can be very, very high quality, I don't know, high quality, but quality wines. So I think it's a very, very interesting and important thing to research. And I think maybe one day it would be part of Israeli wine identity. And definitely that's one of the ways to go. I mean, there are other varieties that are very adaptable to Israel. And I don't think the industry should only emphasize on that. I mean, I think we should go in all directions and research that, definitely.
Thank you. So Jeff, my next question is to you. I lately spoke to a winemaker that we all know and very much respect, and I asked him why he doesn't use any of the indigenous varieties. And in a very metaphor that I felt I fully understood, he said he feels like that the wine industry in Israel is like putting a child in a toy store. And he said, you're running from one toy to another before you actually get to know the toy and get to play with him. You're running to the next thing. And he said, we're such a young industry here. We haven't even discovered ourselves and our DNA, and we're already moving forward to finding the next thing. Do you agree with that? How do you feel with that statement?
Well, I come from a wine region in California that's not much older than Israel's wine region. I don't think that modern day winemaking in Israel, I mean, as Adam said, started with, I don't know how many grands there are, but just a few generations ago, we were getting started with modern day winemaking in Israel. But let's not forget that Jews were making wine in Israel probably 3,000 years ago, certainly 2,000 years ago, and we don't know exactly. So, and they were doing it not because they were so smart, not because they were such great winemakers, but they were doing it because if you take a walk through the various wine regions of Israel, whether it's especially the more traditional ones, such as the Galilee or the Golan, you'll see the kind of soils that I see when I walk through our vineyards in Northern California. which remind me of the vineyards that I see in the southern Rhone and Valley. We see red soils, terra rosa soils. We see a lot of limestone, certainly in the Galilee. And we see an environment that's conducive to grape growing, okay? And so whether it's Dabuki or Chardonnay or Viognier, these are, we have terroir here in Israel that grows really great grapes if you take care of them right. And if you have good grapes, then you can make really good wine, even great wine, if you ferment them well. So I think that, Mor says that, it's maybe too soon to tell, and so did Adam, and it's true. I mean, I don't think we should just run off and try to make only indigenous varietals here in Israel, but I can tell you as a winemaker and a former wine writer, I've had some Dabuki that's as good as any white wine I've ever had anywhere here in Israel. So you can forget about Dabuki not being as good as Bourgogne Blanc. Thank you very much. It's better than a lot of Bourgogne Blanc, okay? And you can also, I've made Argamen here. I've used it in my blends. I won't tell which, that's a secret, but it's a beautiful blender. And if you want to make it as a varietal, okay, go for it. I find Argamen actually has quite a bit of acidity, which makes it, which is one of the reasons it's such a good blender. So it's more than just color, Adam. Listen, I think it's important for Israel to develop and build its own cultural identity. But, we're a Mediterranean country where grapes grow well, and whatever we grow, we're going to do it pretty well because Syrah, Cabernet, I grow them together here. I have a vineyard where I have one growing right next to the other, produces fabulous, wines. You name it, it's going to do well if the viticulture is right and the winemaking is right. And it's happening more and more. I've been here 10 years. The difference between now and 10 years ago is extraordinary. The number of wineries and the overall quality of the wine has just gone way, way, way up, and it's continuing. So I feel very optimistic that whatever we do, it's going to be good.
Great. Though I'll add for me that the only thing that I feel less optimistic about is I can, when I go abroad, I haven't been in the past 12 months, but when I go abroad, I still go to wine stores. I still see these 10, 12 brands that they are great, but it's very difficult to see a more versatile collection from Israel. And unfortunately, although it is changing, but unfortunately, many of the Israeli wines in most of the wine stores, abroad, Israeli wines will be still under the kosher section, which is maybe something that we'll talk about in a bit, which is very interesting. Guy, I want to come back to you with something that you mentioned before, and I feel is kind of our responsibility to talk about it because most of our crowd today is from abroad. You talked about the wineries now, becoming a bit more accessible and maybe adding cheese and just opening up to the public. How accessible is that to people from abroad? If a couple from London are coming to Israel, they're renting a car, they're driving, I don't know, to the Upper Galilee. Will they ever get an app that they can see which winery is open, that they will actually get there? There will actually be a person meeting them there, smiling, handing them a glass of wine? Or is it going to be a well-kept secret for Hebrew speakers?
Okay, so thank you for this question, because you mentioned before the book that we wrote, the Israeli, if you can see it, Wine Journey. Anyways, Wine Journey in Israeli Adventure, and you do have there, it's in English and Hebrew, and you have all the information about all the wineries you can visit in Israel. And currently, there are almost 200 wineries that receives visitors, and most of them have their English website, and they speak English, and they would love to have guests from all around the world. They're looking for guests, for visitors from all around the world. Many of them also ship wine to the US, to the UK, all around the world again. So I think it's very easy today when you're coming to Israel to come and visit. I know that that internet-wise, we don't have anything I know that the Ministry of Tourism, they are working on, I'm not sure if it will be an app or a website that will include everything and that will help you to find all the information needed for that. But it's getting much, much easier today. And actually what's unique about Israel is, Jeff, you're coming from California. Here in Israel, you can visit all the wine regions in one day. I mean, it's so close. I had a chat before we started with a friend. She has an event in a few days in the Golan Heights, and I live in Tel Aviv, and it seems so far away. And I looked at my GPS, and it's 2 hours and a bit of a drive. That's it. That's the other side of Israel. And so you can start your day in the Golan Heights and see the snow on the snowy mountain of Hermon and the taste wine over there. Maybe go to the Kinneret to see where Jesus went, and then go to the Central Mountains where it's very, very unique. I mean, it's like the Wild West of Israel, maybe, very, very green. Or go to the seashore and see the Mediterranean terroir of Israel, and then finish your day at the Dead Sea or in the desert of Israel. And I think it's very accessible. One of the qualities of Israel is that it is very accessible for tourists.
Can I butt in? I'm looking at all the questions we've got. We've got a lot of questions and I don't want to miss people out, but one of them related to what you've just been saying, Guy. Andrew Krause has asked if there's going to be a move towards more experiential opportunities among Israel's wineries and winemakers, like the opportunity to come, see, drink, eat, and stay over at the wineries.
Yes, we are working on that. Yes, exactly. And we're trying to bring more experiences to wineries. So it's not only about coming and tasting wine and cheese. I mean, currently you can also take a picnic basket and go somewhere and sit. But they are working on other experiences, such as 4-on-4 drives or all sorts of drives through the vineyards. And maybe even be a winemaker for a day and make your own wine, learn how to blend your own wine, and then you choose from different barrels and make your own bottle of wine, including even the label of your wine, and many different experiences. I mean, what the COVID made me do is to focus on Israel, and up until the end of 2019. I used to travel quite a bit all around the world, but I decided to try and bring many of those experiences to Israel. So I know that wineries in Israel now will offer, some wineries will show you different kind of soils in the winery and the result of those soils in the wine, and all sorts of different experiences. Yes.
Okay, that's great. That's really interesting. So actually, if people like you and Avahai have the ability to then send people in those directions so they can find where they want to go. Avahai, I'm going to, if it's okay with you, I'm going to pick up some of these questions because
oh yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot. There's a lot. More than one person has said, is all wine in Israel kosher? And I'm going to say no, because even I know that. There's a mix. What would you say there's a percentage of kosher and non-kosher? Anyone got any clues on that?
Let me just say something, since I've been quiet for a few minutes. I think it's, if you're talking about wineries versus total volume, it's very different. So there are a lot of new wineries that are not kosher, small wineries. The big ones, which produce the lion's share of the wine made in Israel, are making kosher wine mostly. So I suppose if we said from a total volume perspective, there's a lot more kosher wine. I've seen figures 80%, 90%. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there's a lot more kosher wine made than there is non-kosher wine. But I think if you looked at brands and labels, you'll find quite a bit of non-kosher wine being made now by by younger, newer winemakers who have very small production and are not particularly concerned with, they're not observant themselves, observant being, Dati, as we say, or Orthodox, as we say in America or in the UK. And they don't really care, and they just want to make wine, good Israeli wine. So it kind of
sorry, yeah.
What?
No, I was interrupting you. Staying on that theme, I've been asked by Ben Grossman, does Mevushal wine taste worse because it's been boiled?
Wow, I love these questions. It's like Mevushal, for anybody who's not looking, means cooked or heated or boiled or whatever. Look, for the purpose of this show, I don't think we should waste too much time on the concept of Mevushal, which is certainly has nothing to do with traditional winemaking, kosher or not kosher. I think that 100 years ago, when you boiled your wine, it didn't taste very good. That's what we do. We cook with wine. It doesn't taste like it did before you cooked with it. So today, if you want to make wine mevushal, almost all of my wines are not. 2 out of the 20 wines I make are mevushal, just because I can't get them into American restaurants without being mevushal. But otherwise, I have no interest in making mevushal wines, and I think most winemakers have no interest in this either. So
there was winemaker in is he in New Zealand? I met him at Kadem, the show, and he thought it made it better, like it matured it more quickly.
Well, I was going to say that the methods of heating wine today are a lot different than they were even 50 years ago. And in fact, you don't even have to heat the wine to make it mevushal. You can heat the grapes or the juice through flash détente or flash pasteurization in some cases, which can heighten aromatics and fruit flavors. I think that it's in white wines, it's a lot easier to do than red wines. I wouldn't recommend it in any case, unless you felt you needed to, because it's totally unnecessary. And whoever that was in New Zealand, you might as well just, forget about it, because why would he bother to do it unless he wanted to sell his kosher wine, mevushal wine, in kosher restaurants in America, which is the only place that people are too stupid to actually, they're too stupid, I think, to actually take the care that they do in London, for example, or in Israel, to just pour good wine that's not heated.
Okay, someone's asked me as my last kosher question, and I'm going to ask more this one. Which kosher wine do you consider the best at the moment?
That's not a fair.
I'll answer that. I'll answer that from a different perspective. So, kosher doesn't do anything. Being kosher doesn't do anything bad for quality.
Yes.
It does mean that you have to follow certain rules. It does mean that the people that are making the wine have to be Orthodox, have to be religious people. So that puts a set of barriers on the winery, but that has nothing to do with quality. So it's hard to say for me which is the best. I mean, there are a lot of very, very good quality wineries that are kosher. So to name a few, I would say Kastel, I would say Tzora, I would say Flam. Vitkin have been kosher for not long. I mean, not for a long time. I know two of the people in the panel here are sipping Vitkin in their glasses. Yeah, and a lot of wineries are kosher. It doesn't have anything to do with quality, but it's a complex story. I mean, it's a complex thing in Israel. And not to go too much deep into that, but a lot of wineries became kosher not because they have any religious views, but for economic reasons, for export, for Jewish markets, etc., but not necessarily because they have any religious belief. But and of course, not all Israeli wine is kosher. That's a question that a lot of people ask, and usually come with the assumption that all Israeli wine is kosher. So no, but I will emphasize it again that except for maybe what Jeff was speaking about, but mevushal, kosher wine, which is not mevushal, can be very, very high quality, and it is. I mean, has nothing to do with the quality of the wine.
I'm going to ask you another question then, because I've something else to say. They're just going up and up, these questions. If you had to suggest 3 good wines, not too expensive, not too cheap, sort of middle of the road for wine tasting, what would they be? And I'll start with more, but I will ask the others possibly.
Are these wines that you can find in the UK or like?
Well, I think that's our problem tonight, because I've got a lot of questions about what you can find in the UK. Is there anyone on our panel who's actually able to help me with that one? Otherwise, if we're concentrating on wines in Israel, because we'd like people to come over there and try it with you in Israel. If you're able to tell me anything that's in the UK, great. If not, then we'll go with what, wines in Israel.
Right. So I know in the UK that you can get Sfera wines and you can get Tulip and Maya, which all three, which all three are very, very good examples of very high quality wines. Sfera is not kosher, and Tulip and Maya are kosher. I also really like the work in Israel of Gabi Sadan from Shvo Vineyards. He was in the team of winemakers in the Golan Heights winery and the Galilee Mountain, and he works. He has his own winery. I think first with vintage. Adam, correct me. I think it was 2009. And he's like your classic vigneron. He works the vineyards sustainably. He works indigenous yeast. And minimal intervention in the wines. And his first wine that he made was actually a rosé. And people told him, I mean, you're nuts. I mean, this is your first wine that you're gonna put out in the market. Make a red, or make an oak Chardonnay or something like that. Put your mark. And he said, oh, I'm gonna make a rosé. And so one of my favorites, and I can also say that Achat that we were speaking about, Jeff was telling us when we got together that he was drinking Achat the other day, and Mialuce and Bar Maor, and these are wineries that I don't think are being exported to the UK at the moment, but definitely the ones to try in Israel.
So can I say something? So, I have to say that my own Israeli wines are available in the UK. And that would be...
Yeah, Victoria pointed that out.
Covenant Israel is indeed our Blue Sea wines. Our Viognier is there. I don't think our Rosé is there, but our Viognier is there. Our Blue Sea Adom, which is a blend of Syrah and Cabernet. And our Covenant Israel Syrah is there. And those are the 3 Israeli wines we have there. And I believe Castel is in the UK, and Castel is, of course, a fabulous Israeli winery and a beautiful Israeli winery for anybody who's coming to Israel to visit. Really worth the trip. I believe, what else is there? There are quite a few Israeli wineries in small quantities there. I want to come back to something Avichai said with finding, being in the Israeli section or finding a good selection, or the kosher section, or finding a good selection of Israeli wines. Has anybody on this panel ever tried to get a distributor for their wines in Israel, the United States, or the UK? Yes, you've tried to get a distributor, Guy? And is
Yes.
Is it easy to get a distributor?
It's not easy. It's never easy, but I mean, eventually you want to have a value for your wine. And I do work with some wineries, trying to some wineries in Israel, and trying to promote them around the world, and also work with wineries from around the world coming to Israel and finding distributors for them here in Israel. And eventually, I think if you have the right value to offer, it is possible, and we've made it several times. Yes.
But value is not a good reason to buy a wine necessarily, unless you have a budget that you can't go above. And value is a problem if that's all a distributor is looking for. And very often they'll say, oh, it's too expensive. But sometimes it costs a lot to make a good wine. So let's forget about value, and let's talk about how many wineries there are throughout the world. I mean, there are just so many wineries not just from Israel, but from all over. And it's getting very, very hard to find a good distributor who will take your wine in whatever market it is, New York, California, Tel Aviv, I mean, you name it, and really do it justice, because that same distributor has hundreds of wineries that they need to promote and sell, low priced, high price. And I think that's a big problem for the consumer, because that's why you're having trouble right now, Victoria, in the UK, finding an Israeli wine in your neighborhood. There are not enough distributors who are focused on Israeli wine, whether it's kosher or not. But I do think in the UK, the wineries that do have a kosher selection will be probably the easier places to find Israeli wines, because they're at this point more open to the concept of Israeli wine. They have more of a market for it. But you can find in the really top end wine shops, you'll be able to find Sfera, as Mor said. You'll be able to find, I think, Gabi Sadan's Shvo wines, aren't they? I know they're in New York, aren't they? In UK also?
So it's
I'm
quite
not sure
niche.
if there are in the UK.
It's quite niche still, isn't it? We're looking in top wine shops. I've been asked actually, can you order online? Is there any ways, and does the wine travel well? People have asked if they can order online to somehow get it direct.
So you can order online. I would personally suggest, we work with a lot of tourists, especially American. I would usually suggest finding somebody in your country to order from. You can order from Israel, but it becomes more expensive, and many times we found there's a problem with taxes. I do want to add, and this is, maybe it's over optimistic, I do know from several of the communities that we work with, again, in the United States, at the end of the day, it's supply and demand. Now that whoever's listening to us, you want good Israeli wines, go to your wine shop and tell them that this is something that you're looking for. So the first 100 people, maybe it won't work, but this will start creating more demand. I know at least 10 different wine shops all over the States that the community came back from whatever it is, trips or just with knowledge of Israeli wine, saying, we don't want only 5 labels underneath the kosher section. We want to really enjoy Israeli wines. And of course, the wine stores wanted to sell, and they really expanded them. I went to visit a few of these places, and it's pretty incredible to see over 25 labels. If it's okay with you, I want to collect this back to something that I think I also saw a few questions, but I really want to touch, which is regionality in Israel. That is, we barely touched that topic. Victoria, how long do we have?
We have very few minutes. We've got 5 minutes, but I don't know if you're able to go over 5-10 minutes. If our audience are, well, they can leave if they've had enough. But if you guys are happy to talk for another 5 or 10 minutes, then we could run it maybe that far. But then
we're all here. Adam, I want to ask you, because you've explained before in a great way. Can you just give us in a minute an explanation about the trademark that happened in the Judean Hills in Matei Yehuda in 2019-20, I believe? This is last year. Just explain to us what it means, this trademark. Is it a revolution in the regionality in Israel? Is it not a revolution?
The wine regions in Israel were originally set up in the 1960s and 70s, before the main boom of Israeli wine. And the wine country was divided horizontally. Now, the topography of Israel is vertical. What's happened, there's been a stagnation amongst the wine authorities in Israel, where we have a sort of quite a bureaucratic, slow-moving operation against the very dynamic wineries where most of the changes in Israeli wine have come from. What's happened is the winemakers have come up with a new regional map for the wines, which is vertical, and it differentiates between the different regions according to topography. And the Judea region, which is basically what I call the Judean foothills and the beginning of the Judean hills, a bit of what we used to call the Judean plain, has now been registered as all our regions should be registered. And like everything that's happening in Israel, it all happens a bit slow, but it's happening, and it's a work in progress. So I hope that eventually, when we have this panel in 5 years' time, I hope I'll still be invited. And I hope I'll still look the youngest on the panel. And I hope
and the
that
prettiest.
when we're talking about wines, we might be talking about regions. I had a good blend from the Judean Hills, or this Golan wine is a good wine, because certainly already I see certain varieties doing better in certain regions than others. For example, Chenin Blanc, we talked about the Ahad Chenin Blanc. I happen to think that Nana's best wine is the Chenin Blanc. It's also from the same region. Merlot does particularly well in the Central Mountains. Sauvignon Blanc seems to do very well, and Chardonnay in the Judean Hills. The Cabernet Sauvignon seems to do better in the Upper Galilee and the Golan Heights. So I already see in my own mind that there is a differential between different regional wines. And I'm hoping that in future we'll talk more about the regions than we will about the varieties. And it's going to happen. So the Judea wine law in Judea is a fantastic first step. Let's hope that we'll continue to, to do the same in other regions. In the meantime, all the winemakers are far more minded about the regional character of their wines, as opposed to making international style Euro blends, which could be made in every other country from the same grape varieties. So we're trying to put an Israeli face on the blends and the wines that we're making. And that to me is really exciting, because this is going to change the face of Israeli wine, which only 10 years ago, everything was varietal, everything was, every winery took grapes from everywhere. It was very hard to say, even small wineries seemed to buy grapes from all over. Now people are far more minded of source, vineyard, and even the plot or the rows in the vineyard. So we're talking about a whole different way of looking at wine growing, as opposed to grape growing, wine growing. It's very exciting, and it's developing very fast. And the horizons of the winemakers has changed in the last 5 years or so.
Someone had asked whether there's a classification organization like the DOC regions, whether Israel has any classification at all.
No, not yet. But one day we will have. But it doesn't affect the wine, the quality of the wine, and the fact we're not so a classification like it is in France can also stifle innovation. So just because we haven't got a classification that's modern, it doesn't mean that you can't make great wine.
Can I very quickly? I'd just like to echo one thing that Adam said about Israeli wine identity and the importance of regionality and authenticity here. I think, I'm not sure, but I think I'm the only winemaker who makes wine in Israel and also in California. And my techniques are very similar, because this is the way I make wine, but my wines are completely different. And that comes from the typicity and the uniqueness of the terroir that I find both in Israel and in our vineyards in California. And there's no way, in my opinion, to make a California wine in Israel or vice versa, because it is a very distinct place that we can easily recognize in our wines.
But I do have to ask you, do you think that this AOC, DOC classification, no matter what we call it, do you think it will revolutionize the industry? Do you think that in 10 years, somebody in UK will come to a wine shop and say, I would like a Golan Heights wine, or I would like a desert Negev wine, versus I would like an Israeli wine? Is this where we're going?
I think Adam was correct.
I would like to answer that.
What?
I still believe, I'm going to give the answer that you don't expect. I still believe that the brand for Israel is Israel. I remember I was in England when they first started getting interested in Chilean wine and Australian wine, and people talked about Australian wine, brand Australia, Chilean wine, South African wine. Our brand, and sometimes we forget it, it isn't Covenant Israel, it isn't Castel, it isn't Yarden, it's Israel. And Israel is what underpins everything, and that is our main brand. what would be fantastic if on the shelves under Israel, they would have different regions. At the moment, Israel is moving out of the kosher section in certain places. I've campaigned all my career for Israel to be part of the Eastern Mediterranean, which means Israeli wines alongside Greek wines and Lebanese wines. And it's happening, because if you go into Whole Foods in Kensington, as an example, Greek wines used to be under a sign saying other. Now they're with Israeli wines, kosher wines as well, Turkish, Cypriot, all these wines are together. If they called it Eastern Mediterranean, my dream would be complete. So we have a place. I always say Israel's not an island and kosher's not a country. We're part of a region, and the region is the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Levant, which is more localized. And I still believe in all our campaigns, in all our talking, the main brand of Israel for many years to come is Israel. And we should always push on Israel. Israel's the brand which we live or die by, and we should remember that. But at the same time, within the brand Israel, to try and develop the regions is important, but still the brand outside is Israeli wine, like it was once Australian wine and is now Georgian wine. Israel is the key word.
Okay, I'm going to, there's so many questions on where to get wine in the UK. I think what I'll do is get people to email me. I'll give my email address, or you can email me through the JC, and we will be able to send you a list of where to get hold of your Israeli wine. So do not despair if we haven't got to that. We do have these answers. We don't have them at our fingertips at the moment. We have 5 minutes or so. I think I'd like to ask, if it's okay, Avichai, all of you actually, including you, your favorite one Israeli wine to try. Ideally, it would be one that we can get here, but we can't be sure on that one. But if each one of you would pick a wine, that would be great. So let's start with, I'll go around my screen. Let's start with Jeff.
Okay, well, I'm not going to mention my own wine again. We're done with that. I would rather say, very briefly, why Castel Winery is so important to me. 18 years ago, 20 years ago, I tasted a wine from Israel, Castel wine, and in the Napa Valley, where I was making wine at the time. And this wine was so fantastic. I said, wow, I want to make a kosher wine in Napa Valley that's as good as this Castel. Oddly enough, that vintage was a 2000, I think it was a 2000 vintage. It was not a kosher wine, which brings us back to the confusion. I thought it was kosher. It wasn't kosher, but it was Castel, which is equally good today, kosher version, which began, I think, in 2002 or 2003. But that wine from Israel inspired me ultimately to start making a kosher wine in California, and inspired me to come to Israel, where I discovered just how phenomenally good and interesting the Israeli wine industry is. So
okay, the Castel label for you.
Castel is the way to go.
Okay, and that you can get here. I know that because I've tasted it at the Food and Wine exhibition. Yeah. So I'll move down from Jeff on my screen to Moore.
Okay, so I've mentioned them before, and I'll mention them again because I definitely know they're in the UK and I really love what they're doing. So I'm going to go for Sfera Winery. I don't know which one of their wines are being exported, but I think maybe it's 2 or 3 of their labels. So Sfera is a winery that produces solely white wine. They call themselves white wine professionals. And again, people thought they were nuts when they started a winery that produces only white wine in Israel. Their style is quite delicate, quite nuanced, quite mineral, and they work in the Judean hills, and in 90% of their vineyards is in Givat Yeshayahu. And they have this very interesting microclimate, which have very, very cool evenings and cool nights. So they can get very high quality whites and non-kosher, and a very interesting, good Israeli white wine to try.
That's Sphera,
as sphere, but sphere with an A. Yeah,
lovely. Jeff, what's the name of the wine store? I'm going to get to the rest of you with my question. The wine store in Mayfair.
The wine store in the-
Hedonism.
Hedonism. Okay, that's somewhere that people can look up because they definitely have a selection of Israeli wines. Adam.
I think there's a golden mean of a wine which has fantastic value. It's not too expensive. And there's one wine that never lets me down. It's called Judean Hills Red of Sora Winery. It's a wine, one of my favorite ever tasting notes. I once heard, and I've copied it and used it till then. It has everything, but not too much. In other words, it's in exactly the right proportion. It's balanced. It's good value. It's I think the least expensive wine red wine he produces. I think it's a fantastic buy. And in Decanter, a British magazine, this year, at the end of last year, it became the first Israeli wine to get into the best wines of the year in Decanter, this particular wine. So Judean Hills from Sora Vineyards is the wine. It's a red wine. And here's a winery that's already naming his wine by the name of the region, which is indicative of what we're talking about. White, I haven't, again, I'm thinking more in terms of something more affordable. I'll go for Tulip Winery because my daughters are working for Tulip. And I now write about wines. I have to be careful who I choose, but at least I've got an excuse for choosing Tulip. The Net Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc is a grape that Israel's making better and better. It's never be New Zealand, it will never be Sancerre, but I think our best varietal white wines these days are being made by Sauvignon Blancs. And the Net Sauvignon Blanc from Tulip Winery is fantastic. It's aromatic, zingy, zesty, and great acidity. So those are my two wines. But the whole virtue, the idea of choosing a wine is absurd as asking someone what their favorite meal is, what their favorite food is, or their favorite music is, because the whole wonderful thing about wine is the variety. So, you know, for us to choose one wine is almost ridiculous because at different times you demand something different. And
True.
the variety of wine,
different day. Yes.
it goes down to one wine. So be open-minded, drink Israel, and try lots of wines, and then people can come to us and tell us which they prefer, which is important for me to say what I like.
While I've got you there, Martin Strauss says hello. He worked with you in the 80s at the Bass Group.
Martin, legendary figure, worked in Hedges and Butler, 300-year-old company with cellars under Regent Street. Nice to see you, Martin.
Yeah, so he's hello. And actually, I just want to, where I've missed people's
contact me afterwards. I'd love to be in contact with you.
Okay, well, he's on the stream of questions, which you probably have access to. So take a look at that. You'll be able to pick him up from there.
Okay, great.
And to Jeff, Antonio Marks. Oh no, that's to you, Adam. Antonio Marks. They're all there. Over to Guy for a wine suggestion.
Wow, so I definitely agree with Adam. Also, what he said about Tulip, we had this wine for lunch today. It was very, very good. And I'll try to do like Adam did and give a more complex answer. Well, the first wine that got me into wine, into loving wine, was Yatir Forest by Yatir Winery, and that was the first time for me that I've tasted wine, and I said, "Wow, that's good. That could be really, really tasty and really amazing." And then a few years later, 1 year later, I tried Margalit Winery. And if you ask me, they're one of the best producers of wine, very consistent and for many, many years. And Yair Margalit is one of the leading wine figures in the world, in at least the wine chemistry in the world. So very, very interesting. But eventually, I got to a white wine, actually an orange wine from a very small boutique winery, actually in the Central Mountain, belongs to Christians. It's called Philokalia, a very, very small one. They make only several thousand bottles a year. And they work only with indigenous grape varieties, with local grape varieties. and you can find it not only in Israel but also in Berlin, in a Michelin star restaurant. Michelin restaurant.
Thank you. Thank
belongs.
you.
Yes.
Yeah, go on. I'll ask you to finish because we're running out
Okay.
of time now.
Okay, so just go to Prism to this restaurant and have this wine from Philokalia. It's amazing.
Thank you. Avahai, are you able to give me literally a name?
Oh yeah. Well, as you were talking,
We'll
I
be
had
very
a
Israeli
list.
about your one suggestion, and we're going over time. I'm being asked to finish. So, a name?
So yeah, I had about 100 labels in my mind, but I'll just mention 3 real quick. First one will be Kovoria. Everything that he makes, you should put your hands on. Second one will be Neve Rak. Their Grenache and their Carignan both are incredible. And third, deep in the south, there is a winemaker called Nana Ranraz. Drink his Chenin Blanc. Except that all 3 of them you cannot get outside of Israel, but come to Israel and search for these wines and other labels that you don't know. And
Brilliant,
on this
Nicola.
note, I'll just say from me one last sentence. This is first of all, thank you very much. This is a privilege to just be amongst the 4 of you, and thank you very, very much. I feel honored. Thank you very much, Victoria, for allowing me to be part of this. I'll let you.
It's my
wrap
great
up.
pleasure. No, it's been a huge privilege. Thank you, all of you, Jeff, Moore, Adam, Guy, Avahai. It's been wonderful. I actually have an article about Yaakov Uriah in the JC tomorrow, so look out for that, anyone out there. But from all of us, thank you so much. And well, we hope to see you in Israel and drink some wine with you in Israel. So thank you, everybody. I think we're going to
Thank you, everyone.
call it a day now. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good night.
Good night.
Leave.